Thank you for praying. Would you take your Bible again, and we're going to turn to Paul's first letter to the church at Corinth. This time, the 13th chapter, and actually, one of the things that the Lord revealed to me this week is the flow of chapter 13 between chapters 12 and 14. So in order to highlight that, we're actually going to start reading in chapter 12, verse 31, and conclude in chapter 14, verse 1. At the conclusion of his teaching on spiritual gifts, verse 31, Paul wrote, "Now eagerly desire the greater gifts, and yet I will show you the most excellent way. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give my body over to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be still. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child, thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Follow the way of love, and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. These wonderful words have been gifted to us by the Holy Spirit through the Apostle Paul. Let us eagerly desire to impart them into our daily lives. Did you notice the changeover after the turkey had cooled and was put in the fridge, how suddenly the entire picture shifted to Christmas? Or did it shift a little bit beforehand? Thanksgiving is kind of becoming the forgotten man, isn't it, in terms of holidays? We have that little blip in the radar, and then we're gung-ho for Christmas. I know in our congregation this morning we have some overachievers who have already got their Christmas prepared. I know we have some underachievers who are waiting until December 24th. And I assume the vast majority of us will fall somewhere in between. One of the things we experience while we're out at this time of year, especially, are are strangers doing what's called random acts of kindness to other strangers. Even though the national week for that is in March, we see it a lot this year. I was approached this week by Richard Hansen, who had a great idea to improve this custom. His idea was to have a card prepared that explains your act of kindness was not random at all, but was the product of a love relationship with Jesus Christ. His idea was to do the act, leave the card, and have a silent witness for Jesus Christ. And that's why you have these cards included in your bulletin this morning. If you haven't looked at it yet, take it out, please, and take a look at it. We have printed several of these in case you are a person who likes to do these acts of kindness. And let me recommend that you take these, and if you buy lunch for a person in line behind you, leave the card with the cashier and have them give it in turn to the person in the drive-thru behind you. If you're paying for the purchases of someone in line in front of you, give them the card and explain why you're doing it. And at the same time, extend an invitation to attend our Christmas Eve service. And in this way, we put the face of Jesus on this act of kindness. J.B. McPhail wrote, "Love is the fabric of a life well lived." Acts of kindness are seasonally appropriate and give evidence of good character. And if we use this card, we can improve upon both with eternal consequences. In order to really understand 1 Corinthians 13, we have to put it in its context. So if you're following along on your message notes, this is the introduction part, where we look at the context of the chapter, placing it in a line with chapters 12 and 14. In chapter 12, verse 31, Paul wrote two things. Eagerly desire the greater gifts. We should stress two words there, eagerly and greater. Paul wrote these three chapters because there had been a problem in the church at Corinth about spiritual gifts. They were sensational, they were exciting, they were snazzy, they were evidence of the power of God, and people wanted more. And it got blown out of proportion. The gift of tongues in particular had been exalted above all others. And so Paul countered this false teaching by saying there are greater gifts than the gifts of tongues. Now, he didn't go into a lot of detail for us, but we can assume that what he meant are these four words. The greater gifts are less sensational, more fulfilling. Less sensational, but more fulfilling. They may not get you noticed. For example, the gift of mercy may never have the spotlight fall upon you for being merciful, but it accomplishes a great deal for God's kingdom. He also wrote, seek the most excellent way. And the most excellent way, as he makes it abundantly clear, is the way of love. This is Paul's transitional statement. It is a link in the chain of reasoning. You see, in chapter 12, he introduces the reader to the idea of spiritual gifts. He defines them for us as God's supernatural addition to the planting and the watering that we learned about back in chapter 3. But then in chapter 13, he puts them in proper perspective vis-a-vis love. He says, yes, the gifts are important, but love more so. And we can have the most sensational gifts and accomplish the most powerful ministry, but if love isn't in it, behind it, through it, there's no point. And then in verse 14, he continues to show how love is to guard and guide the use of the gifts. And in particular, how the misuse of the gift of tongues messed up the worship in the Corinthian church. How it altered for the worse their worship. Paul made it clear that love is superior. It is the most excellent way. Now here's something interesting about that word love in this chapter, folks. There are 3, some say 4 words for love in the ancient Greek language. The one used here is agape. And that word is used only once in all of the secular documents that have survived to our age. So things like personal correspondence, stories, accounts of business, you take all of those thousands of documents that were written at this same time, and only once did they ever use the word agape. The church took that word as their own. And they used it to refer to the love of God for his people and the love that his people have for one another. It's an example of many ways in which the church took the language and the culture of the day and turned it on its head so that it took on a new and divine meaning. And then in chapter 14, verse 1, we are informed that love is a way of life. It's a philosophy. It's an aspect of character. It's something we choose to do day in and day out. Now, with that introduction, we notice that without love, even the spiritual gifts are powerless. Look at verse 1. Even with this gift of tongues, without love, they fail to communicate. Love is the difference between making noise and making headway. Love is the difference between making sounds and carrying on godly communication. And in the practice of the gift of tongues, if there was no translation, a public use of it succeeded only in making noise, and worse, irritated the body of Christ. In fact, I think that's what Paul was getting at when he referred to the resounding gong and the clanging cymbals. He could have just said gong or cymbals, and those were used in worship at the time, both Jewish and Gentile. But it's a resounding gong. It is clanging cymbals. It's irritating noise. Paul says if we try to communicate without loving, we're just making irritating noise. And besides which, there's not a lot you can say with a gong or with cymbals. Even if we all knew Morse code, standing up here clacking and banging is not a good way to communicate. One aspect of love's superiority over tongues is that it will continue to be important after the second coming of Jesus Christ. Look at verse 8. And the event referred to there in verse 8 is the second coming of Jesus Christ. He says, where there are tongues, they will be stilled. There will be no need to speak in tongues. In heaven, the gift will cease. He says, secondly, without love, knowledge and faith bestowed by prophecy amounts to nothing. Look at verse 2. And, as we read in verse 8, the gift of prophecy will ultimately cease. It will cease. It will not be used. Prophecy can be foretelling, which is looking ahead at the future as revealed by God. But most of the time it's foretelling. It's interjecting God's truth into situations where truth isn't being upheld. He says we can learn mysteries and knowledge, which are variations of the same word. It refers to deep and significant truths. And in Paul's time, as well as ours, the phrase moving mountains is a symbol of accomplishing some great thing or overcoming some great obstacle. Paul says, without love, moving mountains means nothing. After the second coming, we won't need the gift of prophecy because all the survivors will know God's will. See Jeremiah chapter 31. Then third, in verse 3, without love, giving, the spiritual gift of giving, has no benefit. Now notice the kind of sacrifice Paul describes here. It's total sacrifice. We're not talking about a percentage of income or anything like that. We're talking about the giving of one's life. Paul said, if I give my body to the flames, if I give my life, I think today we would say, if I work so hard I become burned out. That would be kind of our equivalent. If I give so much of myself that I'm burned out in the process, this profits me nothing. This may be a reference to the trials of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego back in the book of Daniel. But if you look at verse 8 again, you see that Paul did not say that the spiritual gift of giving will cease. Friends, I believe that means that there's giving in heaven. In fact, I imagine that's going to be a large part of our activity as we are there together in eternity, what we give to each other. We see that in this life our knowledge is at best partial and immature. Look at verses 8 to 12. For we know in part, prophesy in part. Our knowledge is always partial. It's partial because it's very much dependent on our point of view. But it's also partial in the sense that knowledge without love is not necessarily a good thing. Earlier in this letter, chapter 8, Paul wrote, now about food sacrificed to idols. We know that we all possess knowledge. But knowledge puffs up, while love builds up. What he meant by that was that knowledge can fill us with pride. We can become a smarty pants, a know-it-all. And in our pride, in our arrogance, be unloving. He also says that our knowledge is immature. Folks, we know the difference between growing old and maturing. Growing old is something that just happens. Maturing is something we choose to do. It happens by application of intention and hard work. And spiritual maturity happens in cooperation with the Holy Spirit. The more we learn, the more we have to admit that there is more. There's always room for improvement. When completeness comes, it says in verse 10, that is the moment when our knowledge will be full and mature. Now we see God only in his reflection in human beings. And sometimes we're rather poor mirrors. And here Paul is making a comment directed exactly at the Corinthian church because in their day, they were famous for making mirrors. Mirrors at that time were just polished metal, and they did reflect, but poorly. Paul says, when Jesus comes again, that imperfection will cease. Love will remain. Third and finally, we have the qualities of true love. And we won't take a lot of time on this because they're lengthy and we don't have a lot of time. But notice that Paul expresses these in two ways. First, on the positive side, he tells us what love is. And when we boil these down, love is others-centered. Others-centered. Remember Jesus' command to love God first. Love your neighbor as yourself comes last. So true love is expressed positively in that it is others-centered. Now look at the specifics. He says love is patient. It overlooks small offenses. It is kind. It seeks to help. It is joyful in the truth. It is unfailing. It is maturing. It is protective. It is trusting. It is hopeful. It is persevering. And it is the greatest of all virtues. Secondly, he says, love is not self-centered. Love is not sinful. It is not self-centered. Look at what he says in verse 4. It is not envious. It is not boastful. It doesn't try to create a superiority over others or win arguments. Love is not proud. It is not dishonoring. Sometimes we're so wrapped up in ourselves we don't care about the honor or the feelings of others. It is not self-seeking in verse 5. It is not easily angered. It is not a recorder of wrongs. Love is not delighted in evil. It doesn't take happiness when people, quote, get what they deserve, or when someone gets away with doing wrong. Horror is not a genre that I enjoy. So I don't read books and I don't watch movies that are of that genre. But one of the most horrifying movies I have seen in my life had no monsters, no killers, no violence of any sort in it. It is a film that was shown to us in elementary school. Perhaps you saw it too. It's called Cipher in the Snow. Anybody heard of that? Know what I'm talking about? Shelley? Marlene? Well, you were in school, Marlene. Did you show that? You've seen it. Okay, sure. It is a short story about a school kid who walks off a school bus and falls over dead in the snow. This sudden and inexplicable death energizes his teacher to understand what it was that killed Cliff, the boy's name. The film was based on a story by Jean Miser, a lady who worked as a teacher and guidance counselor. It was published in the NEA Journal in 1964. So those of you who raised your hands, I'm sorry, you just dated yourself. It was produced by Brigham Young University and used extensively for anti-bullying education and moral training. Though the film does not come out and say it explicitly, it is clearly implied that Cliff died from lack of love. The teacher finds that Cliff had no friends at school, that his parents had divorced, that his stepfather was abusive, that there was no love for him. And I got to tell you, as an elementary school kid, that movie scared the willies out. More than any other horror film or story ever could. And it proves our thesis today. Love is at the virtue that's at the center of our identity. And without it, we're dead people walking. Life is love. Love is one of the easiest things to talk and sing about. Everyone wants to celebrate love. Everyone wants to receive love. But it's not so easy, is it? And especially not at the high standard God sets for love. It's easier and more natural for us to put self first, make excuses to conceal our lack of love. But love is not optional for a follower of Jesus. It is essential. Indeed, it is the definition of our character. I call upon you today to join me in seeking ways to love. Whether you use this little card or not is not the point. The point is that we seek to create opportunities to love, and when they're handed to us, that we act upon. Amen? Amen. Praise God for the love He has given us. We're going to conclude our service today by singing, "Now Thank We All Our God." And we do want to thank God especially for the love He has shown us in Christ Jesus.
Please stand and turn to